Hello and welcome everyone. Today we are putting on part 3 of our ISO 27001 series. We have talked about what ISO 27001 is, what you need to build a program, and now we're going to talk about what you need to maintain your program. So this is ideally for those programs that have already been certified and they're probably going from that initial certification audit into the period of time between the certification audit and that first surveillance audit. So we'll break this down into a couple of different pieces, but hopefully what you walk away from this presentation with is sort of a practical tactics guide of how to go about ensuring that you don't fall into some of the traps in between your audits that would result in non-conformities in those next audits. So the agenda for today is pretty straightforward. First, I'll talk about at a very high level what you're going to need to be successful. This is a great slide to consider if you're having to present to executive teams or leadership about what the program is going to need to operate. The second piece of the presentation is going to be on elements of an ISO 27001 program, basically a plan on a page. So I've built an infographic that I want you guys to be able to take a screenshot of and use. Hopefully it'll be a nice sort of pocket pamphlet for yourself to remind yourself of the different aspects of the program. And then we'll dive into how to maintain the program. I'll talk about it by role first and then by department. Those may sound synonymous, but when I say role, I'm talking specifically about ISMS defined roles versus departments we might have in our organization. And lastly, I'll close with recurring tasks at a glance. So I've kind of extrapolated from the maintenance slides the different tasks that are going to need to happen on a recurring basis, whether it be quarterly or annually. And I've extracted those to give you maybe not a full list, but pretty close to it. All right. So first off, what are you going to need to be successful? So ideally, you find yourself in a situation where you've gotten through the audit. You've closed out stage 2. You may have already had your formal report delivered from the external certification body, and you are certified. So now you're going to be asked by leadership, by different people. Maybe you're asking yourself, what am I going to need over the next 10 to 12 months to make sure that my program continues to operate in a way that will not have any issues during the surveillance audit when the external auditor comes back out? And so a couple of the most high-level things you can think about are, first and foremost, leadership buy-in. So this cannot be a program that was stood up and abandoned, right? You cannot have the leadership of the organization check out from security, right? This is not a check the box. This is an ongoing program that looks for not just continued maintenance and operations, but actually continual improvement. It's a big bullet point of clause 10 in ISO 27001. You're also going to need a dedicated owner. This needs to be at minimum a single person who is dedicated to the operations of the program. Could be a team of people. It depends on the size of your organization, but that person or people need to be 100% accountable for the overall operations of the program. They may not be able to operate all the controls. Obviously, you're going to depend on a lot of different departments for that, but they should know how the program is doing and where the weak spots are and where improvement is needed. Third, you're going to need communication and meeting rhythms. So you're going to want to keep your internal teams, your leadership team, all the different people involved in the ISMS up to date on how things are going. You're going to want to use it as an opportunity to pull information from people to understand how controls are operating, or if there are particular improvement areas or weaknesses or maybe strong areas, right? You definitely want to take time to call out where you're succeeding as well. But most importantly, these can't just be a bunch of ad hoc meetings over the course of the year. You should sit down, come up with a calendar of meetings that are going to occur, when they're going to happen, who's going to be in them, and what the purpose of them are going to be. And the rest of the presentation, you'll see the different things that these meetings need to touch on. But again, establishing that rhythm of meetings is very important. You're also going to need to have mechanisms and ways of spot checking controls and understanding what the recurring activities are. So you'll need to not only understand what each department and person is responsible for, but you're going to need tools at your disposal to be able to validate and verify that those controls are operating in the way that they've been described in policy and procedure. And then lastly, consider a GRC tool. This is there's a lot of them out there. Risk 360 offers one. It's called Phalanx. I'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. We actually have a free version of Phalanx that you can use indefinitely. But the GRC tool in general, whether it be Phalanx or a different one, is going to ideally help you keep track of all of these tasks, and it's also going to give you some really effective mechanisms to track control effectiveness. So it's gonna basically organize all the information together in a way that helps you keep track of everything, and you're not lost in spreadsheets and documents and SharePoint folders or what have you. Okay, so this is the infographic I talked about. If you're on the webinar right now, I highly encourage you to take a screenshot of this. This is basically the ISO program on a page. So I've also got out to the right here the different sort of ISMS roles. So the first one is top management. This is going to be the topmost person or group of people who oversee the functional scope of the ISMS. So if your ISO certification is over a particular product within a much larger organization, it's going to be the top representative of that product team who's accountable for the security program. If it's the scope is the entire company, this could be your CEO, your COO, C-level executives. But you need to define who top management is. And top management is going to be responsible for establishing a lot of the foundational elements of the program. Scope, context, how they're going to be committed to the program as leadership, what are the roles and responsibilities, how should risk management be done, what are the objectives of the program, how are you going to measure the program, how are you going to assess yourself, what mechanisms, meetings, different tools do you have at your disposal to identify and implement continual improvement opportunities. So that's going to be top management. The next level here, sort of in the darker gold color, is a combination of both top management and the risk committee. And I say it's a combination because, again, an ISO 27001 program can be right-sized for a 20, 30, 40 person organization or a 20, 30, 40,000 person organization. It just depends, right? It's going to look very different depending on the size of your organization and the scope of this. So top management may not participate as much in that middle layer. In a much larger organization, they may charter that authority out to other people, and that's fine. In a smaller organization, 100, 200 people, top management's probably going to be involved at least somewhat in these middle tier operations here. And what those are is information security policy writing. So management needs to give direction on all of the aspects of the program. They need to document their intent for the program. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you need to document every single detail about every single control. This just means that you need to lay out a clear framework that the teams can build upon to get to those specifics. I'll talk about procedures in a second because those sort of sit beneath the policy layer. But those are where you want to maintain a lot of your specifics. Policy should sort of dictate a common denominator across the organization for security. Top management's also going to work in conjunction with the risk committee to decide the organizational framework. So they're going to decide how the teams are broken down, who's responsible for what, who's chartered with what authority, what are their jobs. Basically, every aspect of the program's operations need to be documented in a roles and responsibilities document of some type. That brings me down to the sort of light blue layer at the bottom. So again, it's a blend of the risk committee. You may have control owners who sit on the risk committee if it's a smaller organization, or the risk committee may be 100% removed from control ownership. It just depends. But you're going to have control owners and or the risk committee who are responsible for really two aspects. One is the Annex A control operations. So, theoretically, you could implement any control set you want as a part of 27001 and say that this addresses the risks that were identified as a part of the risk assessment. But there's sort of some zealots out there that would say that's the only way to do it. But in reality, a lot of the companies we work with are just looking to get this thing off the ground, and they need a lot of guidance. And Annex A is a very good control set. And so a lot of times we just advise companies to take the Annex A controls, mark them in scope or out of scope accordingly, and run with those. If you're new to this, if this is, if you have never built your own custom control set, I'd probably recommend the same thing. But at the end of the day, the people who are responsible for operating those controls are typically referred to as control owners. They need to not only take the control language from the standard and ensure that they're meeting the requirements, they need to specify how they're meeting those requirements. ISO is both a blessing and a curse in that it puts the onus of defining what right-sized looks like on you, right? It makes you define what does appropriate look like for this particular control. Again, this is where the size of the organization, the maturity, the sensitivity level of the assets you're protecting, all of those things come into play. But this is also where control owners a lot of times feel like they don't have a lot of power to dictate how the program is run. In reality, they should have quite a bit of say in how the actual tactics of control operation happen. So control owners should work closely with the risk committee to document and write procedures that are right-sized for them, and procedures that reflect reality. The worst thing you can do is sit down and write policy and procedure that are very lofty goals, but are not the reality of how the program operates. So you want to put truth on paper. It's always going to be easier to update a policy or a procedure with a little bit more scrutiny or a little bit, to ratchet down like a control or something like that than it is to try to demonstrate something that is a much higher caliber of a control than is actually happening in reality. So. Okay, so now that was sort of ISO on a page, if you will. That's sort of what makes up the program. A little bit of a refresher from some of the prior parts of this webinar series. So now I want to get into maintenance activities, and I've got it broken down into two sections. The first one is by role. So again, we'll talk about those roles we just hit on: top management, the risk committee, and control owners. And then I'll get into actual departments, and hopefully that's where you can really take some good notes on, depending on what department you're in, things that are going to be expected of you over the course of a surveillance year. So top management is going to need to, again, charter any governance structure that needs to happen. This should have been done prior to the first certification, but as the organization changes, as the scope expands or contracts, as organizational change takes place, you're going to need to ensure that you keep up with that stuff with new charters that, again, call out and reflect reality of who's responsible for what. So top management does not have to do everything for the program, but they do need to go to the extent of formally chartering authority for those that are expected to do those things. They're also going to be heavily involved in making scoping adjustments. You've acquired a company, you've rolled out a new product, you are just simply maturing the program to go from a smaller scope to a larger scope. Those scoping adjustments need to be thought out, and you need to communicate extensively with your external certification body as well as your internal audit if it's an outsourced function, to make sure that they're aware of those scoping adjustment considerations. The smoothest scoping adjustments that I've seen are the ones where they are talking about what they're thinking about doing, not updating us or the external certification body on what they've already done. It just helps us ensure that the audit activities cover that scope and there's no inefficiencies there. Also, security objectives. Your security objectives ideally are not going to stay the same year over year. They need to be updated, right? They need to keep up with the program's focus. So year one may be pretty basic things like build the program and get certified. But year two may be to focus on particular weak areas. Maybe it's access controls, or maybe it's defending against business continuity events, things like that. But those considerations need to be baked in year over year. Top management's also going to need to review KPIs and adjust evaluation activities. So if top management is not getting the right information, if they can't definitively say after a leadership meeting or an IRC meeting on security how the program is doing, the KPIs aren't right. Okay, so I want to kind of let that sink in. The key performance indicators should be things that can be measured definitively, reported on definitively, and give leadership the ability to discuss and describe how the program is doing once they review those KPIs. If that feels difficult after a KPI review, revisit your KPIs. So next is the risk committee. So this, again, you can call these a lot of things. We call it the IRC, the Information Risk Council. You can call it all kinds of things. You may have a committee already established. You may have a less formal or a more formal way of doing this. But whoever the group of individuals are that are responsible for overseeing risk in the business, specifically security risk. A lot of times there's other types of risk, obviously, like financial risk, things like that. May be the same people, may not be. But that risk committee is going to be responsible for taking management's intent and taking the chartered authority from the governance structure management's laid out and adjusting the IRC charter as needed. So the risk committee needs to make sure that they stay right-sized for the purpose they're built for, if that makes sense, right? So the risk committee should make sure that, hey, if we're responsible for overseeing risk related to these 4 products, you should probably have representatives from those 4 products on the IRC, right? And if you don't, because you've expanded scope, you probably need to update the charter to include another individual or 2 to make sure that you have the right group. So just think about that. The next is conducting those actual meetings. So the risk committee needs to make sure that I would advise heavily that you're doing quarterly risk committee meetings. If you try to do these once a year, you're going to not only miss a lot in between those, but you're also going to set yourself up for a big risk of missing required topics in your meeting agendas. And those can result in nonconformities later. The risk committee also needs to conduct the annual risk assessment. That can be in conjunction with a third party. It can be done in-house, but they need to oversee that activity and ensure that that risk assessment is done in accordance with policy. So ISO states that the policy should describe a risk assessment process that, when followed, would produce similar results. So that's how you're going to measure the effectiveness there. The risk committee needs to make sure that that policy is written correctly and the activities follow it. They're also going to need to make sure that the risk register is accurate with risk treatment plan progress updates, in addition to new risks and ratings and scorings and things like that. Lastly, they're going to inform on the strategic plan, resource plan, budget, things like that. Usually that's in conjunction with top management, but you want to make sure that you're taking all the information and inputs that you're gathering and making strategic decisions based on those. Again, a big theme of ISO is continual improvement, and this is a great opportunity to implement that, is to document strategic plan changes, resource needs, budgeting considerations, things like that. The last group here is control owners. So again, the control owners are going to be the chief party responsible for making sure controls are operating in accordance with policy and procedure. But what that also means is it's a two-way street. They're going to want to ensure that they're recommending updates to policies where policy may be impractical. Same for procedures. They're going to not only recommend updates, but they're going to actually maintain those accurate procedures. You may have formal avenues for attaining authorization for procedural changes, things like that. Follow whatever that process you have in-house is. But I would highly recommend that control owners be responsible for maintaining the actual procedure documentation. And it should reflect how they do things, so that if I come in and I do an audit and I look for evidence of operation in accordance with procedure, they're going to match up. They're also going to participate in the annual internal audit as well as the external audit and any other control reviews that take place. So if you've got the risk committee or GRC team or something who's checking in to determine if controls are operating, they may need to provide some evidence, get on calls, participate in interviews, fill out some questionnaires. It just depends, right? But the control owners are going to always have to participate in those tasks. If you're being told you can automate this, I promise you it's not right. You really need to understand that, yes, certain aspects of running a security program in accordance with a security framework can be automated, but you're never going to fully remove the human element, because the human element is the most important part. So if you're being told by some software company or something that you can totally automate this, I can promise you that it's not correct. The last thing control owners are going to do is identify risks and report them to the risk committee. So they are boots on the ground. They are the absolute front lines of security. They're running the controls that are meant to prevent incidents and protect the assets that are in scope, right? So it makes sense that control owners are going to have a lot of good input in terms of what risks are out there. So make sure that you're leveraging input from control owners to understand risks and report them to the risk committee and handle them accordingly. All right, so now we're shifting to ISMS maintenance activities by department. So we've talked about sort of roles, but you may be thinking, well, you know, I'm in IT or I'm in engineering, or maybe I have people in IT or engineering, and all they want to know is what they're responsible for. They don't necessarily know what ISMS role they fit into, or maybe they're just a subset of control owners or something like that. This in the next couple slides will attempt to break that down a little better for you. So in general, and again, this is not an exhaustive list, but it's meant to be a good guide. In general, the IT department is going to be responsible for reviewing and editing policies that are pertinent to them. So they need to make sure that any policies that pertain to their activities are, again, accurate. They're going to want to make sure that they're maintaining an accurate and a comprehensive asset inventory. This is not only hardware assets, but also software. So you need to make sure that software that's provisioned on infrastructure, on endpoints, is included in your inventory. And I can't stress this enough, make sure you have ownership labeled. That's a very common gap that I see that can be handled pretty easily as long as you do it with enough advance notice. Also, they're going to maintain and adjust controls for governing laptop security. Typically, the IT team has an MDM solution or some type of a way of managing those endpoints. They're also typically provisioning new endpoints, but they need to be the governing body for laptop security. Usually, IT is the most logical place for that to happen. They're also going to oversee access control and conduct access reviews. So IT may not be responsible for every aspect of access control, but they need to oversee the overall program around access. They need to understand specifically how access is granted to any type of sensitive resources, and they need to give their sign off on that, right? Because if they're going to be the responsible party for access control in general, then they need to sign off on how access is granted to sensitive assets or sensitive information. They're also going to conduct access reviews. Now, a common misunderstanding is that IT is the one that should do the access review for all the systems. That's not necessarily true. You may have system owners, right? You may have a business unit owner or business unit stakeholder who oversees access to some given system, and IT has no idea if this person actually should have access to this or not. That's perfectly fine. They need to send that portion of the access review to that system owner. But this is where a lot of teams drop the ball. IT is the one that needs to oversee that and ensure that it gets conducted appropriately. They also need to ensure that teams are following up on remediation. If some access needs to be adjusted, they need to make sure that happens. They're also typically maintaining network security posture. So any types of updates on networking or how information flows from the outside internet into enterprise networks, all the controls included there. And they're also going to need to govern any kind of messaging and email security. I call this one out specifically because I've seen this come up a lot recently. Consider your client file exchange processes. So if you're a software company, if you have a support function or a client success function, usually they're exchanging some type of sensitive information that's probably in scope with the client. Make sure that you understand how they're doing that and that you provide them with secure and business efficient ways to exchange that data. Because I've actually seen quite a bit of risk and gaps in that area in particular over the last 12 months. The next team we'll talk about is security. Now, this is when I say security here, what I'm talking about is like a security operations center, right? Or it's sort of the team that you'd expect to jump into action if you discover your network has been breached. That's the security team I'm discussing here. They're going to conduct and oversee a lot of security assessment types. Penetration testing, vulnerability scans, things like that. They'll probably work in conjunction with IT. IT may own this more so than security, but they need to understand at least the results of those assessments because they need to make sure that they can respond to those things and that they're apprised of status of any security weaknesses. They also need to maintain documentation for incident management. Incident management is constantly evolving. It's going to evolve based on your business changes, and it's also going to evolve based on the threat landscape. So you need to ensure that you're understanding what types of incidents are we subject to, how is that changing, and how are our processes accounting for that. Security needs to oversee that. They're also going to create and conduct specialized security training. So if the security team is seeing a lot of phishing email clicks, if they're seeing a lot of potential incidents in a specific area, it might make sense for them to sit down and come up with some specialized security training for the organization to help educate people in that area to help reduce the risk of those types of incidents occurring. Lastly is threat assessments. I would argue that the security team should be chiefly responsible for helping to conduct a threat assessment. Now, if you Google this term, you could read information for days. But what I'm going to do is direct you to the newly created control in ISO 27002. This will be referenced in the updated ISO 27001 standard that's coming out here shortly. They've approved publishing for it, and you'll be able to go buy that from the ISO site very soon. But look for the threat intelligence control. There's quite a bit of useful information there on how to think about what threat intelligence is and how to conduct an actual threat assessment. Again, a lot of other guidance out there, but I'm biased and I'm gonna stick to the ISO guidance here. The next team is the GRC team, or the compliance team. So this is usually your group of individuals who are responsible for ensuring that certifications and various security frameworks are adhered to. They're also the team who is typically responsible for using the GRC platform the most. They're the ones who are going to implement how that's done and help inform the rest of the teams on how to do that. They're going to be involved in a lot of the things I've already mentioned, at least on the peripherals, but they're also going to be chiefly responsible for ensuring that all policies are reviewed and edited by the appropriate teams. They're going to conduct and oversee the risk assessment typically. They'll be reporting to or a part of the risk committee. So they're going to need to make sure that those activities are done right. They're also going to conduct and inform those IRC meetings. So the GRC and compliance team is going to be your conduit between sort of risk committee and even top management sometimes and those control owners. You can think of them as sort of the strategic tacticians around the program to decide exactly how the different activities are going to happen and to make sure that all the boxes are checked, right? We want to obviously maintain a security program that genuinely reduces risk, but we also want to make sure we get certified and we don't have gaps in our external audits. So they want to track those sort of boxes that need to be checked along the way in their various tools they might be using. The next team is, I just called it product, but it's really product and engineering. So I'm lumping together things like product management as well as development or engineering. But they're going to inform and update the SDLC policy. So product is usually doing, like product management would do market research and things to determine how to bring a particular product or solution to market. But ultimately, they're going to be handing those requirements to the engineering team. So they work very closely together. That SDLC policy should account for security all along the way. Security is not just a series of gates at the end of a code release, right? Security should be considered at the very beginning stages of a feature design. When you're talking about the design of a new improvement or enhancement, you should at minimum be asking yourself, are there security implications here? And if there are, they need to be documented. So product needs to make sure that that SDLC policy is written comprehensively to ensure that security is included throughout the life cycle of changes. They also need to make sure that teams are abiding by that process. So whatever process is laid out in policy and procedure, they need to ensure that teams are following those. So if you mandate that 2 people need to lay eyes on code before it's pushed to production, systematically you should ensure that there are 2 people who have to sign off on the ticket before that code is allowed to be merged, right? Do yourself favors here and ensure that whatever you put in policy, as long as it's practical, that's a very important asterisk. Make sure that your policy is practical, so collaborate with them as you write it and keep it updated. But once you land on what right looks like, technically enforce that policy with all the various systems we have at our disposal. I can promise you, if you allow shortcuts to be taken, they're going to be taken. So just keep an eye on those things, think about that, and again, Don't paint yourself into a corner with overly strict policy. They're also going to be training on secure coding practices. So they're going to help the teams understand the stack they're using, the different types of languages they might be writing product code in, and they're going to help them understand what are the common gotchas, what are general areas for consideration with just internet-based solutions, what are the things that we need to be aware of as we're coding from a security perspective. They also need to implement processes that ensure that secure coding is happening. They're also going to monitor product changes for compliance with security policy. So what I mean there is the product and engineering team should be spot checking their own change tickets, their own documentation to ensure that every time there's a release, every time the new features get merged, all the boxes were checked. If you're finding repetitive areas of miss where people are not checking boxes, they're not signing off, they're not including rollback plans, things like that, you need to, again, consider, do we need to systematically enforce that this happens? Or is there something we can do to improve the process to make sure this happens when it's supposed to? Again, the biggest pitfall I see in this area is overly strict policy that is not written based in reality. A lot of times it's not even written by people who write code, which can be another whole conversation. And it creates a lot of ambiguity between reality and policy. Do everything you can to marry the two. So the next team will be infrastructure. So this is, sometimes this can be a part of the core IT team, but these are generally going to be things like your engineers who are responsible for overseeing the production environment in the cloud, right? A lot of times there's some sort of a SaaS operations team or something like that that's responsible for production infrastructure specifically. They're not dealing with endpoints usually. They're more focused on servers and databases and things like that. So that team is going to operate and document updates to the change management process. They need to be 100% up to speed on exactly what's documented in the change management process and how those changes are happening in reality. Again, you're hearing a theme here of base your processes and your policies in reality, because that's a very common miss. It's easy to have policies written in a silo, but they become big problems in future year audits. They're also going to oversee the security posture of infrastructure. So, naturally, they're going to make sure that the infrastructure they're developing and maintaining is secure. And they're also going to make sure that the asset management activities we talked about earlier account for the infrastructure assets. So that your web servers, your databases, all of your networking components in between, there's a lot of different ways to reflect that stuff. But just make sure that the asset inventory contains infrastructure assets as well as infrastructure related software, things like monitoring agents and things like that. The last department I'll talk about is customer support. So this is going to be your frontline team discussing things with the customers. Usually this is a support line, this is a customer success department, this is whatever you might call them, client success. But these are usually the people who are picking up the phone, talking to clients, taking issues, and also proactively pushing things and checking in on health of clients, things like that. Their responsibilities from a security perspective are to ensure that they're escalating security issues reported by customers. This is so important. Customers are going to almost always find more in your products than your testing did. Use that information. It's free information that can help you make more secure products. Obviously, you don't ever want to push out security vulnerabilities or insecure product, but it happens, right? It's the reality of agile development nowadays. And so make sure that you're using information collected by this frontline team to ensure that your security posture is improving. Also, make sure that the team is following those secure messaging and data exchange procedures. I talked about this earlier, but customer support is typically tasked with a particular goal of keep the customer happy. And a lot of times, and I'm speaking as a former customer support agent here, that can manifest in ways that take a lot of security shortcuts. So I've got an irate customer that needs something to be done, and I know for a fact exactly where that piece of data that I need to understand sits in the database. Following the process may be to open a ticket with the infrastructure team to go run a query against the database to pull that information back for me so I can get what I need to help this customer. But in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, man, this customer's really upset. I actually know so-and-so on the database team, and I could probably get their credentials really quick and just run this quick lookup and find what I need myself. If you don't think that's happening on your teams, I would encourage you to sit down with your customer support reps and really dig into how they do things. This is a very big area of risk. I can assure you more is going on there than you might realize. And it's never ill intent. It's all intended to keep the customer happy and move as quickly as they can, understandably. But you got to make sure you're doing this stuff in a secure manner so that you stay out of the news. And a lot of that starts with that customer support team. And that goes to this next point, which is they should also be communicating with stakeholders about security posture, right? They need to be talking internally about those weaknesses. You need to enable this team to raise a hand when things are happening in a way that are impractical and creating security weaknesses. They also are going to communicate externally. You need to equip them with security information to push out to customers to help establish that as a competitive advantage in the market. This customer support team has such a loud voice with customers. You want to use that to help them understand all the work you're doing behind the scenes to maintain security posture. And then lastly, just like the rest of the departments, they're going to be writing procedures and informing policy, helping make sure this stuff is right-sized and practical. Okay, so the last slide I'll go over here is recurring tasks at a glance. So again, this is a good screenshot you could take if you wanted, but this is basically extrapolating from all the different slides I've talked through. Without responsibility considerations, this basically are the tasks that need to happen. Now, again, this is probably not 100%, but I'd say this is like an 80% solution on the tasks that need to happen on a quarterly and an annual basis. So quarterly, you need to be doing user access reviews and performing corrections quarterly. You should also be doing privileged account reviews more frequently. So ISO advises that you do general user access reviews and then you look at privileged access on a more frequent basis. So whatever that is, I would recommend at least quarterly for those activities. IRC meetings, again, talked about this already, but you should really consider doing these at least quarterly. A lot of new programs I see do them monthly for at least the first year and then maybe pull back to a quarterly cadence. That seems to work pretty well. If you're looking for inspiration on what to talk about during these meetings and what are good topics for the agenda, look at Clause 9.3 in 27001. You have to cover those on an annual basis with top management anyway. So if top management is in your risk committee meeting, in your IRC meeting, it's a great opportunity to hit on those Clause 9.3 requirements. Vulnerability scans and remediation. This one, I would say do these as frequently as you're able to. Again, don't overburden your teams to the point where you're running scans so often that you're not actually affecting the problem in a positive way. But do these as frequently as you can, because if there's a 0-day vulnerability and you're doing quarterly scans, you could be exposed for 90 plus days, right, to that vulnerability. So just consider that as you're thinking about things. Now, a lot of teams do a great job of staying up to date on new vulnerabilities, and they'll run off-cycle scans to determine if they're vulnerable, and that's fine. But I would say, monthly is not a terrible thing for vulnerability scans if you can keep up with the remediation SLAs. The next thing is password cryptographic key rotation considerations. It's not required by any means by the standard to do this on any particular cadence, but I would say at least quarterly you should take stock of what are the passwords and the crypto keys out there that need to be rotated at some point, and is now a good time to do that. When you're thinking about this, you need to think about who's left the business, what changes have occurred, have people changed departments. Those are usually good candidate triggers for making a rotation of some type of a password or a key. And then lastly is risk treatment plan updates. You should not wait for the annual risk assessment to get treatment plan updates. You'll be disappointed, I promise you. So make sure that you're on a quarterly basis checking in with risk treatment owners to understand where they are in that risk treatment plan journey. On an annual basis, you're going to want to review the scope of your program, determine, at least on an annual basis, is the scope still accurate? Or the other things we want to bring in, or maybe things we want to cut out? Is the statement of applicability still correct? This should be based on your risk assessment activities. So are there any new risks that we've discovered that would either one, imply that certain controls should be brought back into scope, or two, imply that there be additional controls added? So think about those. Next is policy review and approval. Usually, companies have an annual cadence of policy refresh. Now, the mistake I see a lot of companies make is they try to also do the updates during that window. The updates should be occurring throughout the year. You should always have an open door for policy update recommendations. You should probably have a couple of month window for actually reviewing those and deciding what formally gets baked into the policy. But you should always take policy update recommendations and just log those for review during a particular time of the year usually. And also the formal approval, so the final reading and sign off by the appropriate individuals. Performance reviews should be done with employees. We all do these annually anyway. The point I'll make here is that I would encourage you to bake security considerations into your performance reviews. So there's a particular control in ISO that talks about management responsibilities. It's in Annex 7 and also 18. There's a reference to it, but it talks about basically what are managers doing? And when I say managers, think like middle management level. What are they doing to make sure that their teams are abiding by security policy and procedure? Consider ways to include that check into your performance review process. There's a lot of ways you can go about it, but at a minimum, consider asking during that performance review, are there any concerns you have with the team following security policy and procedure? Have there been any incidents on your team over the last 12 months? Things like that. The risk assessment. So again, I would advocate for having an open door policy across the year on risk recommendations. So if someone on the customer support team or the engineering team says, hey, I think there's a risk here, here's what I'm seeing, here's the information, they should always have a way to report that, because time is of the essence with that stuff, and you want to make sure that you're always taking that information when it's freshest. But at a minimum, on an annual basis, you need to do a formal risk assessment where you go out, you interview stakeholders, you look at assets, threats, vulnerabilities, you determine what the risk landscape looks like, and you assess the controls in place to make sure that they're appropriate to treat those risks. Next is vendor risk reviews. Again, these are usually going on throughout the year, but you want to make sure every vendor is at least considered on an annual basis. Now, that doesn't mean redoing their review. You can rank vendors based on severity or risk levels, and you might have a 2-year window for low risk vendors. That's perfectly fine, but you need to make sure you're at least checking on those and making sure that you've not missed any or none have slipped through the cracks on an annual basis. An internal audit, you have to have an internal audit. You can do it in-house if someone can truly independently assess, or you can outsource it to someone like Risk 360. Penetration testing, same thing. You could do it in-house if someone is qualified to do so, and they're independent of what they're testing. Or again, you can outsource that to someone like Risk 360. Security awareness training. This should happen on at least an annual basis for existing employees. Again, I would advocate for more continued training. Try to think about ways to break it up and make it a little more bite-sized and not so dense, and perform that over the course of the year. Usually that sticks with employees better than just one really big training each year. BCP and DR event planning and tabletop exercises. Basically, you need to make sure that your business continuity plans and disaster recovery plans are up to snuff once a year at minimum. You need to exercise those policies and procedures with mock scenarios, referred to as a tabletop, on at least an annual basis. And then lastly, external audit. To maintain certification, you have to get an external audit every 12 months. The first year is going to be called a certification audit. Years 2 and 3 will be referred to as surveillance audits. Typically, those look at a subset of the controls. It's a little bit less of an auditing burden, but it is a full audit nonetheless. And so I talked about this earlier. I'll close with this slide here. So if you're looking for a GRC tool to help you make sense of this stuff, you can look at phalanxgrc.com. We have a totally free version of Phalanx that you can go out and download, or not download, but you can go out and sign up for. And this will give you a lot of tools that will help you do quite a bit of the things that we've talked about in this presentation, again, at no charge. We want to make sure that the market has the tools it needs to at least get started with this stuff. We do have more premium versions of the software with some added features from more mature programs. But if you're just getting started, or this is your first, you're going into your first surveillance audit, and you don't have a GRC tool, I highly recommend checking this one out. There's also, when I talked about the self-evaluation stuff, there's a really good self-assessment included there where you can just fill out the questions and it'll help you understand where the gaps in your program may be. So with that, any questions?
So Sawyer, we actually have 2 questions, and everybody that's online, if you have questions, please feel free to add them to the question bar on your right side of your screen. So the first one that we have, Sawyer, is what are the challenges associated with not having a GRC tool to help run your program?
Yeah, so that's a good one. A lot of times I see teams trying to keep track of status. It could be status of a control, it could be status of a risk treatment plan, status of some project, right? But they're trying to track statuses of a million different things in like an Excel sheet. And that's very hard to collaborate in. I would recommend getting a GRC tool that everyone who's involved can log into and self-update the various items that they're responsible for, because it's going to help you just make sense of and keep track of the program a lot more effectively. Also, completeness of like evidence. So a lot of times teams without a GRC tool, they may be doing everything right, but maintaining all of the evidence to demonstrate that is a really big challenge. So you at least need a place to store files and ensure that you've got that evidence logged. That will help you demonstrate that to an auditor, a customer, stakeholder, what have you.
Okay, we actually have one more question. What are some common mistakes you see just trying to maintain a ISO program?
Yeah, so I touched on a lot of these during the presentation, but some of the common mistakes I would say at a high level are setting program requirements up and then failing to review those in a consistent manner. So if we're not constantly refreshing our minds of what's required of the program, most likely we're missing things in it. So we want to make sure that we are constantly refreshing our minds of what's in policy, what are the controls we need to operate, who's responsible, how are we doing, and not just setting this thing up to get certified for the first year and making the mistake of becoming complacent over the next 6 months, right? This is something that you need to pause and celebrate your certification. It's a very big achievement, but you need to make sure that you don't lose momentum, right? While people are still in that mindset, capitalize on that. This doesn't mean that they have to spend all year, all day long, every day thinking about this stuff, but it does mean that on a regular cadence, you need to engage the right people to make sure that they're not forgetting this stuff and it's not falling by the wayside. That's probably the biggest mistake I see, is losing steam after that first year's audit. The other is just, again, planning, budgeting of time. A lot of times it's not a matter of money, but it's a matter of time. You find yourself 1 month out from the external audit and you realize there's a lot of stuff we haven't done over the course of the year that needs to be done. Make sure you're tracking that stuff. And that goes back to the GRC tool. Phalanx actually has something called a compliance calendar, which is very useful. It helps you track, it's a dedicated space to track all the different activities that you need to conduct to maintain your program over the course of the year. We actually have templates where you can just check a box and add that to the calendar. But however you do that, whether it's in something like Phalanx or in your own personal calendar, you need to track those activities and make sure that you're not getting so overloaded within a short period of time that you risk non-conformities in your audit. So those are a couple of things.
All right, we actually have another question. How much does it cost to maintain an ISO program? And it's a 2-parter. And how do you ensure top management doesn't lose steam in the program?
Yeah, so how much does it cost? It's a very subjective question. It depends on the organization, the size of the The scope, you're looking at, I mean, not to give a cop-out answer, but tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands, could be millions of dollars if it's a big enough company, right? But the range there is very wide. It depends on your needs and your specific organization. It also depends on the level of sensitivity of the assets you're dealing with. So if you're a government contractor dealing with homeland security information, you're going to be a little different than a company who's maybe providing some kind of an efficiency solution for Outlook calendars, right? It just depends. In terms of top management, how do you keep them engaged? You tell them things that matter to them, right? So make sure that they understand the things that are important to them with regards to the security program. So what I mean there is, if you have a revenue-minded organization, you have an organization that's always pounding the drum on sales, they want things to always go up and to the right from a revenue perspective, help them understand how the security program is going to enable that, and then give them information to help them understand how well it's enabling. So things like, since we've gotten certified or since we've implemented these controls or these things, our time to answer prospective customer questionnaires has gone down by 2 weeks, right? Which actually has impacted the sales cycle and helped us recognize revenue faster. Like, put it in terms of what it is that's important to them. It's going to be different for different organizations based on who top management is. A COO is going to be very different than, a VP of security, right? So think about what's important to them. And I know this is crazy. Ask them, sit down with them and understand, if you had your way, if you could build the presentation yourself, what are the things that you'd love to shake the magic 8-ball on and understand the answers to with regards to security? And they'll tell you. And so, that is the simplest answer I can give, is stay engaged with them with regards to what's important to them, and then help them understand things that should be important to them. So if they're totally overlooking something that you feel like is important, tactfully, but help them understand what it is they're overlooking. You can't necessarily always influence that change and make them care about everything that you want them to care about. But the more time you take to put it into terms that are understandable for them and relatable, the better chance you have of them leaning into whatever topic it is that you want them to.
Okay, Sawyer, and we have one more. Do you guys have any other content or how-to guides for people looking to understand ISO 27001?
Yeah, we have a ton of content. You can go to our website and look under the resources tab in the header. That will show you some of the different resources that we have. We have white papers, we have blogs, we have a ton of YouTube videos, webinars like this. There's a lot of stuff out there. You can look at our LinkedIn page and follow the company to get updates on new posts. We're pretty good about posting, new videos that we publish out on social media. But yeah, I would say best place to start is go to risk360.com and look at the resources tab, and from there you can find a lot of other stuff. And go out to YouTube, go out to LinkedIn, subscribe, follow, get those updates, and you'll stay up to date on quite a bit. So.
All right, Sawyer, that's actually all the questions we have for today. So thank you everybody for attending. Thank you, Sawyer, for doing great content once again. And guys, look out for invites for part 4 of the series coming out soon.
Absolutely. Next time we'll focus on ISO 27001 in plain English. So we're going to be doing like a comprehensive review of the first 3 parts of the series in a way that's maybe a little more digestible. So if you showed up to any of the others or listened to those recordings, I highly recommend this last piece, because this will hopefully help solidify some of that stuff and put a little more rigidity around the understanding of it. So I look forward to talking to you all then.